So have you ever heard the argument that a country's foreign policy can be too pure, too principled, and ultimately, well, just too naive? Take a listen to this famous critique from Shashi Tharoor. He says foreign policy was an end in itself, rather than a means to promote the security and well-being of the citizenry in whose name it was conducted. It honestly perfectly encapsulates the most common, prevailing view of independent India's very first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. For decades, the dominant narrative has painted Nehru's foreign policy as this pure, starry-eyed idealism, a kind of messianic utopianism, completely disconnected from the hard, calculating realities of national security. It's definitely a compelling narrative, right? It portrays a leader who basically sacrificed national interest at the altar of global morality. But we have to ask, is it actually accurate? Well, scholar Andrew B. Kennedy completely flips that narrative on its head. He argues that Nehru's idealistic rhetoric was actually camouflage for an essentially realpolitik approach to world affairs. So we've got a really sharp dialectical tension here. On one hand, you have the myth of the naive idealist whose grand visions went totally awry. And on the other hand, you have this academic counterargument of a canny, strategic practitioner of statecraft who was quietly calculating national advantage the whole time. This tension between myth and reality, that is exactly what we're going to unpack today. All right, welcome everyone to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this lecture-style overview of how Jawaharlal Nehru built an Indian foreign policy and, honestly, an entire foreign ministry from almost nothing after 1947. We are going to rigorously deconstruct this historical figure by diving deep into the academic literature. Our main goal here is to move way beyond those superficial caricatures and truly understand the complex institutional and ideological foundations of modern India's role in the world. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The myth of the idealist. 2. Inheriting the foreign ministry. 3. Nehru the liberal realist. 4. Non-alignment in practice. And finally, 5. Assessing Nehru's legacy. Okay. Let's jump right into Section 1, the myth of the idealist. The debate over Nehru is fiercely contested among scholars. As Andrew B. Kennedy notes, Nehru is often viewed in retrospect as either a heroic visionary or a tragic figure. A lot of scholars disparage his efforts to save the world through things like disarmament and non-alignment, claiming he just neglected hard Indian interests close to home. But others insist he was actually secretly highly focused on international competition. I mean, they point to his eventual military seizure of Goa from the Portuguese, or his quiet, incredibly calculated efforts to lay a foundational infrastructure for nuclear capabilities. Kennedy challenges this sharp, binary distinction. He suggests that trying to put Nehru into a rigid box of either idealist or realist completely misses the fascinating nuance of how he actually governed in practice. Moving on to Section 2, Inheriting the Foreign Ministry. This brilliantly illustrates a core academic argument made by scholar Pallavi Raghavan. When Nehru set up the Ministry of External Affairs, the MEA, to steer his vision of a new independent foreign policy, it was supposedly built from scratch. But notice the striking historical irony here. The MEA's antecedents placed it at the very heart of the British Empire. Independent India's interests incredibly mirrored the strategic concerns of the colonial government. Colonial buffer zones simply became independent border consolidation, imperial migration networks transformed into the management of overseas citizens, and imperial trade transitioned into new economic partnerships. The institutional memory was deeply etched into the system, and much of the new ministry's day-to-day work actually meant retaining colonial practices by deliberate strategic choice. So, the absolutely crucial point here is that Nehru couldn't just build a foreign policy using political appointees and grand ideals alone. He needed experienced bureaucrats. He relied heavily on the Indian civil service. A key figure to remember is Sir Girija Shankar Bajpai, an astute and exacting colonial-era civil servant who had actually represented India in Washington during World War II. Nehru appointed him as the Secretary General of the MEA in 1947. Together, they aggressively drove the professionalization of the ministry, setting up a federal public service commission to rigorously recruit diplomats. They even made the highly calculated decision to keep India in the Commonwealth. Just think about what a pragmatic shock that was at the time. After decades of a bitter, bloody freedom struggle against the British Crown, Nehru prioritized the realist need for preferential trade terms and international standing over pure ideological purity. Now, let's define a specialist term that is absolutely vital here, the political service. Under British rule, the Indian political service was the administrative body that liaised with princely states and critical buffer zones like Baluchistan, Afghanistan, and the Persian Gulf. Raghavan argues that independent India's early contacts with neighbors were largely dictated by the precedents set by this very service. The MEA didn't just invent its neighborhood policy out of thin air, it consolidated linkages that were established by the colonial government in the interwar period. It's fascinating because modern diplomacy in this region literally still wrestles with the legacy of these exact same buffer zones today. And all of this rapid institutional evolution happened at breakneck speed amidst the catastrophic violence of the 1947 partition. In 1946, the interim government was formed, which is where Nehru first articulated his foreign policy. Then, in 1947, independence was achieved, and the MEA inherited the formidable machinery of colonial diplomacy, actively sharing out assets with Pakistan. By 1949, Bajpayee's commission had formally recruited a fresh batch of 89 officers into the Indian Foreign Service. A fully professional diplomatic corps was essentially born right out of colonial ashes. Which brings us to Section 3, Nehru, the liberal realist. To really understand his mindset, scholar Srinath Raghavan applies a super fascinating framework to Nehru, which we can define as liberal realism. Liberal realism combines a liberal abhorrence of war, viewing it as inherently destructive to human society, with a cold, realist recognition that conflict is an endemic feature of politics because all nations are fundamentally moved by self-interest. Basically, Nehru believed heavily in moral principles, for sure, but he simultaneously maintained that in an imperfect, dangerous world, a state absolutely has to be prepared to use force to defend itself. So where did this unique blend come from? It definitely wasn't accidental. Nehru was a deeply rigorous thinker. As Raghavan notes, in his early years, Nehru was heavily influenced by the liberal idealism of philosophers like Bertrand Russell. But as he immersed himself in anti-colonial politics and read deeply into world history, his worldview evolved. Imagine the intellectual whiplash of blending Bertrand Russell's pacifist ideals with the raw power dynamics of Karl Marx, or the works of theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who later became a foundational figure in American realism. This broad exposure deeply grounded his appreciation for the undeniable role of raw power and national interest. This philosophical blend resulted in a highly specific, calculated approach to crisis management. Nehru actually described his own style to Egypt's President Nasser as a step-by-step approach. Step 1, always take the first diplomatic step. Step 2, take the second step to demonstrate firm resolve. Step 3, carefully take the third step to avoid what scholars call the escalator of war. To ground that theory in reality, just think of the outbreak of World War I, where initial military mobilizations rapidly trapped nations into a devastating total conflict because they left themselves no off-ramps. The escalator only went up. Nehru absolutely hated the escalator. He preferred cautious, incremental measures that coupled military pressure with active, deliberate diplomatic off-ramps. Now, Section 4, non-alignment in practice. Non-alignment is so often misunderstood simply as a sweeping moral crusade for global peace. But let's define it accurately based on the actual source material. Non-alignment was a pragmatic policy framework of steering a middle course away from the Cold War power blocs. Yes, Nehru believed the bloc system would inevitably lead to a disastrous world war, but primary sources, specifically his private letters confided to his sister, prove it wasn't just about idealism. It was the right course because it actively and fiercely protected India's hard-won political autonomy. Andrew B. Kennedy breaks down the incredible utility of non-alignment into 3 highly pragmatic pillars. First up, autonomy. Nehru feared that aligning with a superpower would essentially reduce India to a mere satellite state, dictating its domestic policy from abroad. Second, military practicality. By remaining unaligned, India could successfully diversify its arms suppliers. Under Nehru, India wasn't some pacifist utopia. It actively acquired military equipment licenses from the UK, the US, and even Sweden. And third, influence. By not locking into a bloc, India became a vital diplomatic bridge. Nehru himself boasted in 1948 that India had become the 4th or 5th most important country in the entire United Nations. And Nehru used international institutions like the UN to exert that influence in a very realist way. Take 1947, when the Netherlands launched a sudden military offensive to restore colonial rule in Indonesia. Nehru didn't just write a polite letter expressing moral outrage. No way. He went straight to the UN Security Council, invoked Article 34, charging a direct threat to international peace, and convened a conference of 19 Asian nations in New Delhi to actively halt the Dutch. He essentially weaponized the UN pragmatically against colonialism, because India realistically needed a peaceful, non-imperial environment in its own hemisphere to successfully develop. But as history shows us, liberal realism and non-alignment eventually faced their ultimate stress test, bringing us to a pretty dramatic climax. In the mid-1950s, Nehru was at the absolute peak of his global influence, feted in Beijing in '54 and Washington in '56. But relations with China fundamentally soured over a border dispute. Fast forward to October 1962. China launched massive military offensives, and India's frontier defenses completely collapsed. Facing the catastrophic subjugation of eastern India, the pragmatist emerged to ensure state survival. By November 1962, Nehru wrote directly to U.S. President John F. Kennedy, pleading for comprehensive military assistance, and later even allowed U.S. U-2 spy missions to operate from Indian bases. When forced to choose, he rapidly abandoned strict doctrine to save the state.
Finally, Section 5. Assessing Nehru's Legacy. We return to classical international relations theory with this incredibly powerful quote from E.H. Carr. Sound political thought must be based on elements of both utopia and reality. Kennedy uses this theoretical anchor to frame Nehru perfectly. Nehru was highly idealistic in seeking to transform international norms, absolutely, but this idealism always maintained a sharp, underlying realist edge aimed at securing vital strategic advantages for the Indian state. To summarize your core takeaways for this explainer, let these foundational points sink in. First, Nehru built his foreign policy machinery not from thin air, but by deliberately harnessing colonial institutional memory and professional civil servants. Second, he operated as a liberal realist, successfully blending a moral desire for peace with a very sharp eye for state self-interest. Third, non-alignment wasn't just a buzzword, it was a highly calculated tool to maximize Indian autonomy and global influence. And finally, when extreme crisis hit in 1962, he proved highly adaptable, prioritizing the hard security of the nation over rigid ideological doctrine. I want to leave you with a provocative question to consider for your own seminar discussions. If a leader as intellectually rigorous as Nehru saw his carefully calibrated liberal realism crack under the overwhelming pressure of the 1962 border war, can any modern post-colonial state truly balance moral ideals with the ruthless demands of hard security? It's a fascinating, difficult question that remains incredibly relevant on the global stage today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.